going to be the host for this webinar. I am Shanti Pise, and today me and my team are going to present a very important topic which is very close to all of your heart, and that is assessment. And assessment we are clubbing together with learning because we feel that these are the two sides of the same coin. So we are here to have a team teaching experience. Until now you have seen that you have get an experience of co-teaching, so we thought that we will try a team teaching experience. So me and my team are going to be here today to discuss about assessment and how learning takes place, how to do students assessment, and what role assessment plays in our teaching learning experience. And to do this, the first session or the first part is going to be taken by my colleague, Ms. Prachi Pasalkar. Now, she is a physicist by qualification and education, and she is one of the most caring and amiable personality who is having a motherly aura, which makes her to be one of the most loving teacher. And she is also very passionate about teaching learning experience. So today Prachi is going to discuss about the purpose, why actually we should assess, and what are the types of assessment she's going to discuss with us. So over to you, Prachi. We are very eager to hear from you.
So thank you so much, Shanti, and thank you for that very nice introduction. So can you all see my screen now? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yes. So I'm, as Shanti mentioned, that I'm going to talk about assessment purpose and its types. So assessment is something, very close to our heart, as Shanti also mentioned. And here you can see one picture where there is a race going on, where students are running. So here assessment is like, it's a process where teacher and students together is a part of this process, and it's sort of in this entire teaching and learning process, assessment plays a very important role. So what is this assessment? What does assessment mean, right? So assessment is a systematic process of gathering empirical data to measure whether the goals are attained or not, right? So over here, measure the degree of attainment of learning goals. So as a teacher, when I have to teach a particular concept to my students, I have decided that what I will be teaching, right? And for that, whether my students have learned that to the extreme or that I want, for that I have to do what? I have to do some assessment, or I have to check their understanding, check their knowledge, check their skills, whether they have learned, or attitude, I have to check, right? So assessment is also, this is very important, that assessment is not meant for sorting learners by their grade, but it is used for, measuring the learning of an individual. And assessments can be both, structured, not structured, or unstructured, and to determine which strategies to implement to assess students learning, etc. So yes, so when we do assessment of our students, what do we assess? Yes, what do we assess when we assess our students, when we give some test to the students? What is that we assess? Can you please type your answers in the chat box? Yeah. So
Okay,
yes,
we
the
have
question is,
haven't get any response. So yeah, we are
yeah.
getting
So conceptual understanding,
yeah.
I could see the responses. So performance of the student, learning outcome we are testing, know whether our teaching is effective or not, right? And if there is any gap between students' understanding and teaching of this teacher, also the problem solving abilities, etc. So these are the different things, or these are the different aspects that as a teacher I would like to know whether my students are understanding or not. And for that purpose the assessment is there. If you go to a broader point, then if a student is taking a particular course, so at the end of that particular course, what is the outcome, whether the students have understood the concept or not, right? Or fared well in that particular course or not, is something which we get to know due to assessments, right? So I could see that there are a lot of responses coming, and yeah, thank you for that. So yes. Okay. Yes. So understanding the role of assessment in learning, right? So the question was, what do we assess? So we assess professional skills, factual knowledge of the student, whether they have understood the concept well or not, problem solving skills, yes, based on the concept which I'm teaching, whether they are able to solve the problems, reasoning skills, then creativity, collaborative skills, whether they are able to work in groups, yes, writing skills. So all these are the various factors which I would like to test or I would like to assess when I'm teaching a particular concept. So these are the various various things or various factors which I as a teacher would like to assess. And that is the, this is the role of assessment in learning. If I want to test the learning of my students, I have to test this on various factors, or I have to assess this on these various factors. Yes, so basically, assessment plays a very important role in learning. So, assessment for learning, yes, it helps teacher to understand information about students' understanding of a topic. Yes, whether the learning is happening or not, and how does that happen? If I as a teacher understand that my student is lagging behind in some particular point, so then based on my feedback, the student is expected to improve on that particular topic. So provide feedback about learning and then the students will improve. So in this way, assessment helps in learning or assessment for learning, right? And assessment as learning. So how is assessment as learning? Because over here, assessment involves students in the process of learning where they monitor their own progress also. Now the teacher is there to give the feedback, but students also get to know where they are lagging, and based on their own will, they will progress, right? They will improve based on the feedback which the teacher is giving, and they will improve based on that. So assessment as learning and assessment of learning. So all these three, right? Assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. All these three factors are important. And assessment of learning means it will also tell the teacher that how much the students have learned. Or I as a teacher, if I've set some learning goals, whether I have reached my learning goals or not. So assessment of what is the learning happening, or whether the learning is happening or not, is there any gap between it? So how can or what can I do to bridge the gap between learning and understanding of the students? So all that I get to know through assessment. So assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning, all three factors are important, right? But when we talk about assessment, we that this word somehow it comes with assessment and evaluation. So what do you mean by evaluation over here? So assessment and evaluation, or assess and evaluate, are related to each other, but they are not same, right? They are definitely not same. So what is the difference between them is, so for evaluating means you evaluate or determine whether the students have mastered the content or knowledge or skills or attitude. So in the same way, we also discussed about assessments, right? So in assessment, the same knowledge, skill, attitudes are checked, but over there it's moreover like giving feedback and then the student will improve. But for evaluation, it is checking, or just checking whether the students have mastered the content or not. After that, after evaluation, there is no scope or whether the students will improve or not, right? So after evaluation, there is no scope for improvement, but in assessment there is scope for improvement because there is feedback, and this is a continuous process which happens. So in evaluation, it is just making a judgment about how much the student have learned. Now, for example, suppose some examination is there. So it's sort of the grades are set that 60% and above is first class. So it's checking against some value or some grade, or let us say that above 40% marks if the student is getting, then pass, fail, etc. So all the setting of a criteria. And evaluation is mostly it is used to sort learners on the basis of their grades and classes, etc. So this is a very nice example. I like this, and it tells us the difference between assessment and evaluation. So this is a cartoon. Over here, you can see that there is a person who is watering the plant over there, and in the first case, he is watering it and then assessing it, that what can I do to increase the quality, or what can I do to make the flower bloom better and so on. So based on the feedback which he is every day he's seeing that plant and watering it, based on that he will decide that how much water should be put, or some fertilizers or what has to be put over there. But evaluation is to judge the quality of the learner. So over here, he is just standing by the side of the plant and he is making the comment that it's too short, it does not have enough leaves over here. So this is a basic difference. For assessment, you have the scope for improvement, and evaluation is a judgment that is made on the learning that has happened. Okay. Now over here, there are two types of assessment. So basically there are three, but here we will be discussing more on formative and summative assessment. So these are the two types broadly: formative assessment and summative assessment. Now what does this mean? Right? So formative assessment is more like a formal and informal assessments are there which are used throughout the unit of the course. Now suppose, for example, I'm teaching a particular topic to my students. Let's say I'm teaching Newton's laws to them, and while I'm teaching that particular course, I'm conducting tests for them to understand how much they have understood about the concept. So formative assessment is formal and informal both. Formal in the sense I can take a small test or I can give a small quiz to the students, and informal means I can just ask questions to them and get the information about how much they have learned about the topic. Okay, so over here, formal and informal assessment that are used throughout the unit or the course of the study to monitor students' progress is something called as formative assessment. And over here, it is used during the learning process. It provides feedback to the learner and which will help the learner to improve, and it is often ungraded. So for example, the example which I gave you, suppose I'm teaching Newton's laws, what I can do is when in the process when I'm teaching this particular concept, and suppose I'm done teaching this concept, I can give a small test or a small quiz at the end of the topic that I have taught, and which will where I will come to know where my students are lagging, whether they have understood the laws well or not. And I can reframe a quiz or some MCQs and so on that, right? So formative assessment, it identifies the students' current understanding, what they have understood about the topic, encourages students to self-monitor their progress, right? It includes feedback and opportunities for the students to revise and improve their understanding, and it is ungraded, it's specific, timely, and it is related to the learning goals. So from this, I will come to know whether I have attained my learning goals or not, whether students have understood the topic or not. And based on that, based on what is the output of the assessment or formative assessment that is there, I will give feedback to the students and they will improve, sort of, right? So next is the summative assessment. So summative assessment is something which comes at the end of the learning process or at the end of the term, etc. So the goal of summative assessment is to evaluate or to measure students' learning at the end of the instruction of the course, comparing it against some standard or benchmark. Now the examples of this is a midterm exam or a final project, a research article that the student have written, a final exam, viva during the practicals or oral exams, etc. Right? So the continuing the same example of Newton's laws. So I've taught the particular concept of Newton's laws to the student, and a question is appearing in the midterm exam where they're answering that particular question is the summative assessment of that particular topic, right? For them. So summative assessment, it happens at the end of the term or at the end of when you're done teaching that particular topic to the students. So this is a very nice example which gives a difference between formative and summative assessment. So what I have over here is you can see a nice soup bowl over here, and so let us say that when the cook is tasting the soup, when he is preparing that soup and he is tasting it, and what does he do or what does he do? So based on the taste, he will judge it, and he will add some salt or pepper or whatever corn flour to it based on what the taste, what is the desired taste he wants. of the soup, right? Now over here, when the cook is tasting the soup, he has the freedom, or that much feedback is given to him by himself when he is tasting it, of course, that what improvement has to be done. So this is somewhat, you can compare it to the formative assessment. But on the other hand, when the soup is served to the guests and they are giving feedback on it, that it was very nice, or something was lagging in it. So after that, there is no improvement to it. So that is something you can say that it is summative assessment, right? So now, just to summarize, so formative and summative assessment. In formative assessment, the purpose is to monitor the progress and provide feedback on the work submitted or the learning of the student. Over here, in summative assessment, the purpose is to measure the overall performance of understanding of the student. Okay? So when is formative assessment done? It is done during the learning process, often monthly, quarterly, weekly tests, etc. And over here in summative, it's periodic, often at the end of the year or at the end of the semester. Now, what is students' view on formative assessment? It enhances the performance, allow the students to make the most use of the feedback given to them by the teacher before submitting the final work, or before summative assessment, I can say over here. But in summative, it consists of standardized assessment, sum up of achievement, okay, what they have in that particular semester, or the final grading, right? And some examples of formative assessment is weekly test, monthly quizzes, or essays, proposal plan, peer or self-assessment, or classroom polls. Yes, so these are some examples of formative assessment. You have many more, or you must be trying many more examples or many more types of formative assessment in your classes. Do let us know about it. In summative assessment, we have midterm tests, or term end exams, final essays, reports, assignments given to the students, portfolio, and projects, etc. So that is all that comes under summative assessments, right? So this gives us a difference between what formative and what summative assessment is. Both are equally important, right? When we are in the teaching and learning process, both formative and summative assessment, both are equally important. But formative assessment gives us, nowadays there is more focus on formative assessment, because it tells us that us as being the teachers and also to the students, that what improvement has to be done, and based on that, the summative assessment or evaluation will happen later on of the entire course. Yes. So hope this information was useful, and thank you. Over to you, Shanti, for the next part.
Thank you so much, Prachi, for taking us through the purpose of assessment and also making us understand what is formative and summative assessment. So, we have discussed the types of assessment. Now, let's go further and try to understand how to assess and what things we should keep in mind while assessing the students. So, for that, I have my colleague or the another gem in this webinar is Dr. Asim Auti. Now, he is a very stable and having a cool attitude personality, and he creates an environment with his resourceful and generous nature, which makes him one of the fantastic teachers. So we are very happy to have here Dr. Asim Auti. He's going to discuss what should one know and how do I know that one knows. So let us understand how should we know that what one knows. Okay, over to you, Asim sir.
Yes, thank you so much, Shanti. Am I audible, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks a lot. Um, I'll like you greatly, rather the way in which you said this title. It could not have been better. So thanks a lot for that. I'd just like to tell now in next 10 minutes, I'll try to cover and try to find answers to these questions. For that, I will request Shanti actually to help me with.
Yes.
So Shanti, can you start your video? Okay, thanks a lot. So what I'm trying to do here is trying to simulate maybe an average classroom that takes place overall in most of our schools. And I request you to wear a student hat right now, not your teacher's hat. And
Yes.
let me teach you what is montillation and what are the uses of taxonomy, which is very important.
Yes, I am
So
not a
can
biologist. I am a mathematician.
No, no,
So
it's
yeah,
okay,
it's a
Shanti,
very
but
good.
everybody should know what this is. So please,
Okay.
yeah, so please, can you just read this quickly, and
Yes.
then I'll tell you what to do.
Okay, the montillation and the uses of traxolin. It is very important to learn about traxolin. Traxolin is a new form of zointer. It is montilled in Seristana. The Seristanian found that they could crystallate large amounts of fervon and then bracter it to quasal traxolin. This new, more efficient bacterialization process has the potential to make traxolin one of the most useful products within the molecular family of Leucises, Snape's laws.
Snail's
I don't
laws,
know
yeah,
how.
correct, absolutely, absolutely. Since now you know what taxonomy is and what is montillation, let me quickly assess how much you have understood, right? So this is a quiz. My first question to you is, and I request our participants to also write your answers in the chat box. Tell me what is taxonomy.
Traxolin is a new form of zointer.
Okay, yeah, correct. Um, Second question is, where is it mounted?
It is mounted in Seristana.
Correct, great. I could see some of the participants are also writing the correct answers here. Third question is, how is taxonomy quasseled?
Okay, it is in the second paragraph. The last line is there. The
Okay,
Celestian
okay,
found
I can
that
give you
they
that.
could
Okay, fine, fine.
distillate large amounts of fervon and then bracter it to
Correct,
quadratic oxygen.
correct. That's the straightforward process. Correct. And last question is, why now do you think taxonomy is important?
Because it is the most efficient bacterialization process and has the potential to make traxolin one of the most useful products within the molecular family of leucisins, Snape's laws.
Correct. Great. So I have done my assessment. I could see you have learned what is taxonomy, right?
So I have not understood
So
anything in this.
I now request you to remove your student hat and wear your teacher's hat
Hmm.
and tell me, did learning happen here?
No, I could understand what the answer is because of few words which I knew, but I didn't understand the real meaning because
Yeah.
what is
But
the inter, what
so
is
so what do you
mounted.
think?
The
Do you think
process is
learning
what I
happened
didn't.
here, even though I did my assessment?
Yes.
Do you think learning happened,
No, learning didn't happen.
even though I assessed, right?
Yes. Yes.
Exactly. And I think most of our participants will also agree with this, that this is not what we should call as learning, even though assessment is taking place. So my point here is, it is very important that you consider many factors actually when we are thinking about teaching and learning a particular topic or a whole course, etc. But to begin with, the beginning is very important. That is, what is my intention? What are the intended outcomes of this particular process? And then we can think about assessment to assess whether these outcomes have achieved or not, right? So I think, I'm sure most of you uh, must have heard this before and also worked on this before, that at the beginning, there is, of any course or any class, there is something which we call as intended learning outcome. What do we intend in a particular class or a lesson that our students should learn at the end, right? And what they should be able to do, right? So this is something, it's a very well known statement I have put here, that good design always starts with good understanding of the desired results. I'm changing it a bit, and I'm calling this as, a good class always starts with a good understanding of the desired outcomes. So before we go into the assessment and details of types and so on, it is very important. This is my point, is that we should first think about what are the outcomes that we intend, uh, uh, in terms of our teaching as well as students learning, to happen in this. And I'm sure you must have heard about ILOs before, and you must have studied this when you did your BEd, EMed, and so on, MAd, and so on. So it is very clear, as the word suggests, ILOs would actually help in defining the type and the depth of learning students are expected to achieve, right? And at the same time, they will also provide a particular benchmark in terms of, if you do formative assessment, summative assessment, what Prachi was saying a few minutes back. And it will also help you to understand your students' prior learning, right? But having said that, ILOs also have many other advantages. So it is important that ILO, if you use them, if you think about learning outcome before you start your teaching, they will clearly communicate overall expectations to learners, what is expected from them, as well as it is important for you to also understand what you should expect from those learners, your students. It also helps in many other ways, up to guiding us and guiding everyone in terms of what can be the outcome of the whole course that you are teaching in particularly. So having said that, these ILOs can be used, for example, just a second, I'll just open the laser pointer. For a particular lesson, one lesson that you are teaching, for example, is what is expected at the end of the lesson from your students. But that does not limit to a particular lesson. That can can be extended to the outcome for the whole course as well as for the whole institution that you are working in, which may be autonomous or not, doesn't matter. So for every design and every class and every course, it is important, first of all, before you enter the assessment, to think about intended learning outcomes. So this process is what will help us deliver forward, right? But for this process to happen, it is important to first design backward, think about the end product first, and then start developing your lesson. So in short, basically at the beginning, the expected educational results that each student should obtain upon completion of the lesson or a course is what I am suggesting we should start with always, where at the completion, what we'll able to know or what we'll able to see. So what students need to know, think, and do, these are three different things when they have completed a particular lesson or a given course that you have taught. But you can see a gap here, right? So you have something in mind and you expect something to happen at the end. So the gap I'm suggesting can be and should be filled by assessment. So assessment, like Prachi was saying, plays a threefold role, right? It is not just for evaluation, but it is also for understanding and for learning also. A keyword that I put here that I call as engagement, right? Which is engagement with students in learning, as well as gauging their learning and whether that is fitting and that is in better words, aligning with our intended learning outcomes. So keeping this in mind, I just quickly brush through what type of outcomes one can expect and then can be assessed. One major group which can fall under cognitive outcomes, basically which describe what students should know. These are some examples given here. For example, student will be able to recall core content of a particular lesson or a topic. Another outcome can be affective, that is describes what a student should think or an attitude that student should have. For example, see this, student would be able to compare differences between X, Y, Z, right? So these are few examples of affective kind of outcomes. And I'm sure you are parallelly also thinking that few examples or few classes in your cases that where you must have thought about this, perhaps realize this is this type of outcome, and also thought about how one should know that whether this outcome is reached or not. And the third type is behavioral, which describes what student can do in terms of demonstration, in terms of problem solving, critical thinking, and so on. Now, when you hear these things, I'm sure you also must have heard about Bloom's taxonomy or the new or modified Bloom's taxonomy, uh, where it talks about different levels of perhaps expectation from your students, different levels of critical thinking and cognition that you can expect from your students. And for that, you can design your teaching method, as well as you can design the assessment to check whether these levels are met or not. So this is where I'm talking about aligning between what you expect at one hand and then assessing whether you have achieved that or not through the process of assessment. The backward design that I talked about at the beginning is basically explained here as start at the end and process to the beginning. Meaning, don't think of the content first. Don't think about what you are expected to teach first, but think about what your students are expected to learn at the end. To assess that, think about assessment and then go into designing your particular lesson or activities, which combines with the content. So these are a few keywords I'm putting here on the slides. Perhaps later you can have a look at it in general and know more. But having said or sort of established the philosophical background of what we are trying to do here, let me now share maybe a few slides with you that will help us really understand practically what we can do to make sure there is an alignment between what we expect and what is coming out of our teaching. So this is an example of a tool called as alignment table. If you know about this, please type in the chat so that we'll know. Uh, So to begin with, one should think about the learning goals and learning objectives. Basically the outcomes of a particular lesson or a particular module or even a particular course that one thinks about. So to talk about what are learning goals and all these things that I've highlighted here, let me put some questions to you. You think about them and the answer to those questions will give you what you should expect or what you should think about when you fill such a table. So for example, learning goals. The answer to the question, what will student learn in a particular class or a lesson? The answer to that is your learning goal. Learning objectives, to be more specific than goals, if they have learned it, a particular example you can think about in your mind, what will students know and be able to do once they have learned what you intend them to learn is your learning objective. And how will you find out whether they have done that is your assessment. How will student demonstrate they know it or able to do it is your assessment. And at the end, you can think about those activities. What will students do to learn it? So if you could answer these questions, you are actually talking about your learning goals to your learning activities. And here you can see together we are aligning the beginning and end with assessment. So this is just an example of a table. So the topic here is, being a biologist, I thought it is easier for me to explain using a general goal or a general topic of DNA and how it transfers its information to proteins. So my goal can be students will understand the transfer of information from DNA to protein. This is something perhaps 7th, 8th, 9th and 10th standard students will learn. Now, based on my goal, my learning objective in this case would be students will be able to predict changes in amino acid sequences caused by mutation. Now, you see, from the goal which is broader, I've made it into a unique objective. Now, if this is going to happen at the end, then how would I know that my students have learned this? So, student will predict the amino acid sequences that results from mutation in a given gene sequence. So, if they are able to pass this particular test, then I know I have achieved my objective and we are close towards the goals. This is just an example of activity, and there can be many more activities. But I will now sort of talk about the first example that Shanti and me did. So there was some teaching, there was some learning, and there was some assessment also. But since the learning objective or the outcomes were not clear, you cannot come to a conclusion whether you are successful in teaching that particular case, and you won't know whether your student have really understood what you had in your mind. So if you could think about aligning this together, the alignment of ILOs as well as the assessment, then the assessment itself becomes a very powerful tool to teach, certainly, right? What Prachi was referring to. Also to get feedback, there are informative assessment. There are many ways to get feedback. And later, Neeraja and Apurva will be talking about this. It is also a very important tool to communicate. Your students are able to communicate with you and you are able to communicate with the student to these regular assessments. And also evaluate not just your students, but us, our teaching also. And also report and share, because these assessment will help you to go back to your alignment table and think about what you wanted at the beginning and whether it is being achieved at the end or not. But please keep in mind, this is not for sorting or ranking. I'm not talking about evaluation. I'm talking about assessment for, of, and as learning. So this is just one way of practically doing the assessment process from beginning to end. Of course, when you start working on it, you can obviously change these parameters and boxes. But let me quickly take you through one process that I have defined here. So where one can start with organizing the assessment, different types of assessment, as well as what kind of assessment you can do on your own and what are prescribed by your school or the system. Based on that, you can define the mission. There is no one else more unique and more responsible than a teacher to define the mission and the goals of a particular teaching exercise or lesson. Then come to defining student learning outcomes. Then think about different assessments. So here, parallel, you are thinking about how I should be teaching using different methods that we have seen so far in this webinar series. Identify assessment methods and targets for each learning outcome. Then collect the data, go through the whole process of analysis, provide feedback to your students, to your colleague also. Then think about implementing, and also once you are implementing, monitoring those changes and comparing results from last week, this week, maybe last month, even last year. And then think about reviewing this information so that the process, the whole process of assessment and aligning it with learning objectives can be made even better. I'm Paradis, it is just give me a second. Okay. So I know these couple of slides have a lot of data, but I'll put it there because later also you can have a look at it, because it's important for me to just continue and complete the process I want to basically share here. And later we can obviously discuss it during the question answer sessions. So here, more going into more practical aspects of it, it is important to benchmark. So think about ILOs and benchmark for assessments. So here, this is thinking smart, planning your achievement, planning your targets and working towards them in a very systematic manner. So for example, when you will think about now on ILOs and assessment, please keep this in mind that ILOs are set by you because you are the teacher and you are the responsible person. Set ILOs that are meaningful. Make sure that the level of assessment that you are thinking about meets the level of outcome. If you are thinking about higher order skills, but your assessment is not checking higher order skills, there is a gap. So this is what I mean. ILOs can be updated as part of assessment cycle. So there is alignment in both ways. Think about ILOs first and then assessment. Think about assessment also and then perhaps modified ILOs. Multiple ILOs can be set in a single lesson or topic. And at the end, result uh, from previous year or your previous exercise or previous lesson can be used to set new ILOs to match your assessment or the levels that you have in your mind. On the right hand side, I've just given an example, maybe more questions, because we started with a question, right? So for example, what type of assessment would indicate that the ILOs for the lesson are achieved successfully? So here we are, okay. So see here, what we are talking about is what type of assessment would indicate that the ILOs for the lesson are achieved successfully. If you think about assessment, think about ILOs at the end. How many students need to reach the desired level of learning for whole teaching process to be called successful, and try to keep assessment benchmarks basically for every assessment instrument.
Asim, bit of time check.
Yeah, sure. So this is the last slide. So answer to the question that Shanti asked at the beginning, what should one know is basically ILOs, and how do I know that one knows is basically assessment. And there are a few more questions. If you think about it, we'll provide you more answers. So thank you so much. Over to you, Shanti.
Thank you, Asim, to make us understand like how we can know understand with the help of assessment and how we can have ILOs into consideration when we are thinking. And so this is the linking between learning and assessment. Thank you for bringing these in front of us and discussing this. Now we have another two members coming up in this webinar, and they don't need any introduction as such, because we have Dr. Neeraja Dashaputre and Dr. Apurva Barve. And Neeraja is going to discuss today what are the modes of assessment, and Apurva is going to continue further and tell us with an example also how we are going to assess. I would like to have only one sentence about each of them. So Neeraja is a adventurous personality. She's very, very passionate, curious, and she like to experiment. And that is what makes her very enthusiastic teacher educator. And I'm very sure the students in her class and as well as all the teachers are also very fond of her, this aspect of her personality. We also have Dr. Apurva Barve, who is a very passionate and diligent personality, and who is a very strong leader with very, I would say, an excellent communication and written skills, and which makes her an incredible teacher. And we are very happy to have you both to discuss about how assessment and what are the modes of assessment and how this assessment can be taken forward. So over to you, Neeraja and Apurva.
Thank you, Shanti. I hope everyone can hear me, and it's great to be here in this webinar series as a speaker. So let's begin. Apurva, will you share the screen?
I will, yes.
Yeah.
So thank you, Asim, actually, for the very, very detailed take on intended learning outcomes. And why I say that is because when we look at the whole process of teaching, the intended learning outcomes really define how our the whole outcome is going to be for the teaching process as well. So not only the learning process but the teaching process, because the moment you align everything with that alignment table that Asim was talking about, the moment we align these things, the learning really gets aligned, and as a result your teaching also gets aligned, if I may call it. So when we look at the process of teaching, Apurva, can we go next? Yes. So when we look at the process of teaching, the first thing I really want to know is, what do I want my students to learn? The next thing is, I identify the best teaching practices, and these teaching practices are mainly the pedagogy aspect. So like, do I want to try an inquiry based method here, or should peer learning be probably a much better thing for this? Or we looked at so many simulation based learning. Is that a better way to teach this particular topic? So once I know what my students should learn, I identify best teaching practices. And then the most important part, that is planning the assessments. And how do I know that my students have learned something is comes at the third step. And this is where I feel all of us can make improvement as a teacher, because very often we only think of what final exam to write at the very end, right? Very few of us, and I guess including me, when I first started teaching, I didn't have this habit of planning my assessments very ahead of time. And the moment I started doing that, everything started falling in place very beautifully. Then comes scheduling and sequencing of the learning, as in what to teach first, then what assessment to have, how do I make sure that learning is continuously happening. So as Prachi was saying, the role of formative assessment, how do I make sure that my students are in a continuous learning process throughout the semester, and not only look at the summative assessment that happens at the end of the semester. And really, when I say formative, it means in every single class, like making sure that I have said something in the class, whether my students have understood what I'm saying in that very class, is very important to for me to design my next class. And then comes the technology. So when the pandemic started, most teachers and most of the webinars that I saw were about technology. It was about what technology to use for which process, and how would the knowledge of technology will make us better teachers. And even at the start of this webinar series, we did think of this, that let's make a webinar series only on technology. But then we started thinking that this is not what makes your teaching better or worse. Technology comes at the fifth stage. If I really think of my process of teaching, if I don't have the first few things very nicely done, then no matter how beautiful the technology is, the learning is not going to be great. So I would like to give an example of a Bond movie, like with all the visual graphics and very beautiful effects and beautiful fight scenes. If the story of that movie is not good, I don't think I'll enjoy the movie. I'm pretty sure that no matter how beautiful the visual effects are, the story is still one of the most beautiful things. And that's why when we think of some of the really great teachers, those great teachers were not great because they had the best technology at their hand. They were the good teachers because they actually had these first few steps very beautifully aligned. And the sixth step is, of course, reflect and improve, because teaching and learning process, and improving on your teaching is an ongoing process. I don't think anyone is the best teacher. We all are learning how to be better every single day. So let's go next. So when I'm planning the assessment, Apurva, yes. So as I said, if I want to plan my assessments, I need to really look at what are the different strategies of assessments that let us know about the progress of student learning. And I'm sure that most of us are bound by what the final exam has to look like, or the structure of the final exam, or the time, and all of these other things that teacher restrictions basically we have. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the summative assessment or the final assessment at the end of the semester, but I'm going to spend a little more time on what can be done in every single class, in your class that you're doing virtually as well. So I want to move beyond the short quiz, multiple choice questions, exams, questionnaires, presentations, so many things. And in presentations, we have so many other things, poster presentations, maybe a PowerPoint presentation. But let's try to move beyond these strategies, and let's try to look at some of the very useful strategies for formative assessments. Having said that, we are aware that digitally or doing this virtually will be difficult. So we have listed some tools that you might want to try in your classes. For each of these short quiz exams, do try some of these as one of the ways to really conduct assessment. But as I said, I want to really focus on the formative part of it. So let's go next. So some of the examples of in-class modes of assessments we have given here. So you have minute paper and Muddiest Point, which is mainly used to show individual learning, whether someone, like an individual student can give you this feedback at the end of the class. The Muddiest Point, Clearest Point is probably one of the most well-known and, well-used kind of mode of assessment, which is I just ask my students that at the end of the class, please send me a note with what was the muddiest point, that is what was the most unclear thing in today's class, and what was the clearest point for you. And that gives me some indication that probably I need to spend a little more time on this particular concept and know a little bit more the next time I go for the presentation. Now, there are some tools which are good for peer learning and really can be done in groups or in pairs. One of the things is Think, Pair, Share. I think Shanti had talked about it, and we used it also, wherein individually we all, or your students, think for the first minute, then they share their analysis or share their perspective with a fellow classmate. So in the pair, they discuss. So let's say if it's an open-ended question, they discuss what would be the answer for that question in the pair, and then they share it with the whole class. And there's an ongoing discussion that happens. So Think, Pair, Share is something that is probably the easiest to use online as well. Especially if you're using Zoom, you can use the breakout rooms, and you can ask students to maybe think in groups and then come back with a final answer that the whole class can really discuss. But there are a lot of other things. So you can play a lot of different games. We also, I remember, tried making a word cloud in Shanti's session using Mentimeter. Again, peer review, brainstorming, all of these different things will make your students talk to each other and come up with peer learning, and you will be able to learn how the class is doing cohesively as an in-class mode of assessment. I've written audio and video here because we are in virtual teaching and learning. And what I feel is, although it may not be done in pairs. It is better that we give such assignments to be done in groups, because making an audio or a video file, you need a lot more inputs than just when you need to make a presentation. So typically it is helpful to have this kind of assessment given in group. But I just want to do one more, give one more example of an in-class assessment or at the end of the class assessment. Let's go next. And I think this was the question asked in one of the webinars is, how do I use a prayer model for chemistry? And then I thought, okay, let's try to come up with a prayer model. And the prayer model, as we knew, it talks about a concept. The students are supposed to write definition, characteristics, examples, and non-examples. So when I was designing a lesson plan for, I think 7th or 8th class, it was elements, compounds, and mixtures in chemistry. This is a very wonderful place to use the prayer model. I asked my students at the end of the class to complete the square, in the sense that tell us what did you really understood about elements. What some other students can give me examples of compounds, some other students can give me examples of mixtures, and then when I look at all those squares, I will be able to really analyze how many of my students have understood the concept, and if there are common misunderstandings, I can always address it. So basically, assessment is a way for me to learn how much my students have learned, and for me to improve in each of each one of my lectures. The next one I really wanted to talk about is so all of these activities that we talked about, but I know we are in virtual teaching and learning environment, so we can really modify the activity as per our need in the case of this pandemic. So for example, I want to share here a very beautiful guide that was written at the start of the pandemic and it was contributed by multiple universities, but it was initiated by Louisiana State University, and we will be sharing it with you. It was called Active Learning While Physical Distancing. And the whole idea was that for each of these activities, what can be done when you're working in an online synchronous environment, what can be done when we are learning in online asynchronous environment, and in a physical distance classroom, what can be done. So I'm just going to share one of the things from this particular write-up, and it has very, very beautiful resources. You will have various ways to engage and also assess students. So this is a 3-to-1 activity, but what they have done is, what can I do when I'm teaching online such that it's a live session? What can I do when I'm teaching online in a non-live session, and so on and so forth. So I really request all of you to have a look at this. It's one of the most beautifully created resources in this pandemic. And the next thing I wanted to share is just make it fun. I wanted to share one of the examples of my organic chemistry class, and this was an extra credit assignment for my students. And what I told them is, we are all in chemistry classroom. There is no restriction on the medium, and there is no restriction on the subject. So, we have to work with chemistry, but in chemistry, it can be anything. It doesn't have to be organic. It doesn't have to be inorganic. It doesn't have to be something that we have talked about in class. So I told my students to submit anything at the end of the semester. And really, I was, pleasantly surprised, because I was sent poems, I was sent stories, I was sent plays, toys, paintings, different memes, students modified videos, students showed chemistry mechanisms using videos. There was films, food art. So we even played a game. So I think you can see the cupcakes there. We even played a game of Cupcake War. And it was such a... Now, if you really think about it, it told me a lot of things about my students, because I could get to know that such and such student is more interested in cooking, So next time I met him or her, I tried to make a conversation about food chemistry. Then I could see some of the other students who were really interested in making videos. So I used to discuss various good videos in chemistry that I was seeing. So the whole assessment didn't remain as a chemistry assessment, but it became as a learning tool for me. So I think someone had asked a question, how do I make these kind of assessments as a learning tool for teachers? So this was one of the examples that I thought of sharing. But then if you really think about it, how do I really assess such a diverse submission? Because if my students are submitting poems, stories, cartoons, sculptures, I'm not the right person to really assess these things. So Apurva, can you guide us about how to assess these things a little bit?
Well, yes, sure. So this is where I come in, and we will definitely talk about, how to assess things and so on. I mean, how to basically realize how to assess performance-based assessments, grade them, etc. But before that, let's take a bit of a break. And it's poll time. You see on your screen, I hope. I hope I'm audible and the screen is visible properly.
Yes, Apurva.
Here you see a pretty lady in a nice dress. And now I will request Neeraja to launch the first poll. I would like you to consider the dress that our model is wearing and rate it. So 1 mark is the lowest. And if you really, really like the model and the dress, then I would like you to give 4 marks. I mean, or somewhere in between, right? And I see the poll running. We will wait till a few of the people have voted. Okay, so most people seem to really like the model's dress and the model herself. So it's about, most people are giving her 3 or 4 marks, right? Okay, great. So, yeah, overall, more than 80% of the people have given her 3 marks or more, right? So now let's go to the next question. And the next question is, consider the dress that our model is wearing and rate it now in terms of its suitability for the model's skin tone and frame. First, you were just generally looking at how the model is and so on, looking and so on. Now, particularly in terms of the suitability of the dress for her model and I mean her frame and skin tone and so on. I'm sure many of you are wondering why exactly are we discussing models and their dresses in a session on assessments, but I hope to be able to convince you that this is relevant.
Rajendra Rane sir is saying, but this is very subjective.
Oh, is it really?
And Aanchal Verma is saying it's individual perception.
It's individual perception. Okay, okay. We will come to that in a minute. Again, most people, I think more than 80% of the people again have given her 3 to 4 marks, which means we feel that the dress suits the model's skin tone and frame and so on and so forth, right? So I'm going to stop this poll and go to the next question, which is now consider that the dress that our model is wearing and rate it in terms of its suitability for teaching in a school classroom. Now, what do you want to do? Do you think the model and her dress is suitable for teaching in a school classroom? Well, why not, right? Oh my God, this time we get a very unanimous kind of answer. Clearly, I mean, more than 90% people so far are saying that they are giving her very low marks, which means that most people consider that this dress is not suitable for going and teaching in a school classroom, right? So you see, I hope I've been able to make this point that it was the same model, the same dress, in fact, the same picture, but 3 different questions. And for most people, the answers changed, right? And somebody even commented that this is very subjective. How do we know what we are supposed to look at? So if you look at the suitability of the dress for the model's skin tone and frame, yes, it's perfect. It looks nice on her and so on. But is it suitable for teaching in a school classroom? Probably not, right? So this is what brings us to setting the criteria for assessment. And so it will be very unfair to give an assignment or an assessment to the students and without the teacher or the student having thought of what are the criteria on which this piece of work, or in this case our model's dress, is going to be judged. If it had been told to the designer that you have to design a dress which is suitable for teaching in a school classroom, probably the designer would have performed in a different manner, right? Or if the designer would have been given details of the purpose and the objective of the dress, they would have worked towards that. So this is where we come to having specific criteria for assessment. And to do that, a very helpful tool in our kitty is rubric. So rubric is a scoring tool that explicitly describes the instructor's performance and expectations for an assignment or a piece of work. So when you give an assignment to or a task to students, what is it, what level of performance do you expect from them is something that a rubric can tell you. So rubrics look like a matrix with basically different aspects of the tasks listed on one, in rows, and the level of performance in columns. So this pretty little cartoon is also, telling us the same thing. This girl wants her father's opinion on the drawing, but the father says, if you really like me to comment objectively, you have to give me a rubric, right? Which is exactly what our one of our participants also said, right? But what are the specifications? It's a very subjective thing, whether it is nice or not. Yeah? So it is exactly the same when we give an assignment or a task to our students and we then go forward and grade it. We need clear criteria to be defined. So this tool or these rubrics can help you grade assignments of all kinds, including written assignments, presentations, class participation, etc. And like I said, it looks like a matrix. On the rows, you have different criteria. For example, if you were to create a rubric for grading an essay on a particular topics in history, say, you would have things like what is the relative importance of the sources to the subject? Are the sources that the person has used in writing the essay relevant to the subject or the topic of the essay? What is the quality of writing? What is the quality of argument? Are all of the concepts and all of the arguments synthesized and integrated properly? These might be, some of the criteria on which you are grading or on which you are assessing the essay. Whereas on in the columns, the second part of the rubrics is your columns, which describes the standards. What are so you can have for quality of writing, this essay is very poor, or it's adequate, or it's great, but the quality of argument is actually quite good. So you can have assignments which do very well on some criteria but are not so up to the mark on others. When you have a clear definition of what is it, what aspects you want to assess in a particular task, then it becomes very easy and fair and consistent to actually conduct this assessment. So why use rubrics? Used effectively, I think I've already made some of these points, but just to sort of summarize the use of rubrics, and I hope the example that we used about the model and her dress also conveys this point well, that unless you have clarity in the criteria, it will not be an effective assessment. So if you make rubrics like this for the assessment that you design, it will expose the components of any task or assignment. You will know that you and the students will both know that these are the various aspects that will be looked at when this assignment is submitted. It communicates expectations very clearly. Once you have a very clear rubric or matrix for assessing a task, it automatically, the evaluation process or the assessment process becomes fair and consistent across the students, right? So students also know what to expect, and they also know, isko itne marks mile aur mujhe kyun nahi. If you have a rubric, you can justify why a certain assessment was given a certain grade and so on. It also helps to provide a specific and focused feedback on the performance. So the student himself or herself will know that, oh, okay, I did well in the writing aspect, but my arguments were not very well thought through. Okay, so things like that. So the students themselves get feedback on their performance, and basically that's why, like Asim and Prachi have been saying, that formative assessments particularly pertain to should be looked at as a tool of learning rather than just sorting students of who is doing better and who is doing worse. They should help students themselves learn. And these kinds of rubrics can actually crystallize that process a little more, because they will now their own level of learning, the breakup of different components of a task will become clear to both teachers and students using a rubric, and this will enhance their learning process itself. So when you go about making a rubric, there is usually a cycle of steps that goes on. First, you have to decide the criteria that you want to use to assess certain, so assess the performance. For example, if it's a singing competition, there could be specific criteria, that is that were the lyrics, pronounced properly. Was the person in tune? Was the person in synchronous? Was the singing in synchrony with the orchestra, and so on. So these are specific and objectively measurable criteria. Then you can then that means that you have defined the rows in the rubric, right, in the matrix. Now you can think of the columns, which basically gives you a developmental scale. It can be a numerical scale like we use for the dress and the model, like you give 1 mark, 2 marks, 3 marks, 4 marks. The lowest gets 1, highest gets 4, and so on. But it can also be a more qualitative scale, where you say that whatever your learning outcomes was, again, going back to what Asim has been saying, that you need to know what your learning outcomes are very clear. And that will also help you define quality levels in your rubric. That how close to your intended learning outcome is the student. Is it a beginner stage? Okay, they've just started understanding this subject, but they have not quite mastered it. Or they have an intermediate level of knowledge about this subject, or they have entirely mastered the learning outcome or the topic that you had in mind, right? So defining quality, and it's important that the first, the lowest one, the mark 1 and mark 3 should be clearly distinguishable, and you should clearly define what these differences are. It also helps to share drafts of your rubrics with colleagues, because as fellow teachers, they will be able to give you very useful feedback and opinions and advice about improving your rubric, and also with students, because they are the ones who are going to actually do the assignment that you're going to give, that you're going to grade with this rubric, right? So it is also important to get feedback from students, but it becomes very difficult for students to use a rubric properly unless they are trained on it. So when it comes to students, and we'll talk more about this in the next slide as well, it is important to train them on how to use these rubrics. For this, you can actually provide samples of successful student work from previous classes, last year's batch or something like that. Somebody who got a very high grade in this type of assignment, how did their work look? And with respect to the rubric, can you compare and tell why their work was graded or given higher grades and so on? So share the rubric with students, require them to attach it to the assignment, so they themselves are responsible for different parts of their work, right? When they know that these are the criteria on which they are going to get graded beforehand, and they submit the assignment along with the rubric, it always improves, gets them a sense of higher responsibility towards this. And then actually, when you are actually using the rubric to grade and to give marks for the assignment, it also builds trust and ensures consistent and fair marking, like we were saying. And when you return the rubric to the student when you give them back their assignment, so that they themselves know and understand and analyze their own performance. So it's a very, very helpful tool for self-evaluation, right? And so going back to this, if once students are familiar with the nature of rubrics, you can also use rubrics to peer assess. So if you ask students to assess the work of their peers, but give them a rubric to do it against, it will ensure relatively fair assessment of students amongst each other, right? Because they know that they have to give marks based on specific criteria. And of course, use this analytics of your own rubric to improve and revise your rubric for the next assignment. So this sort of completes the rubric cycle, how to use the rubrics. And we've already discussed what steps or how in the ways in which you can use a rubric to grade various assignments. Now I'm sure you will say that this is all fine. You can use it for grading essays and question answers and so on. But our suggestion or we encourage you to develop and use rubrics for any kind of assignment. And Neeraja has already sort of told you that how important it is to have diversity in the types of assessments. That it's not just always question answers or MCQs, but you should have other kinds of assessments also. So what about these kinds of assessments? Can you really use rubrics to, in the assignment that Neeraja referred to, for example, where people brought in cupcakes, some made, cartoons and so on. So do you think this is possible, Neeraja?
Okay, thank you, Apurva. So yes, this is possible, and this can only take place once we start designing rubrics for performance-based assessment. So again, going back to what we started with, is that the philosophy comes first. And the assessment that we have to design has to be in line with your philosophy. And in other words, if I really want to say this, that if we don't assess what is important, then what we assess becomes important for the students. And for that, this is probably one of the most stated statements about assessments, is that you need to assess what is important. Otherwise, what you assess will become important for the students, and they will take it forward with them. Okay, so to give an example, I want to talk about how we designed the organic chemistry practical exams. And all of us agree that chemistry practical exams are one of the most difficult things to really make rubrics for, because so very often students are asked to conduct an experiment and submit their product, or submit write up a few questions related to the experiment, and that's it. Very often they feel that that's the way we can conduct exams. But then when we thought of what was our philosophy, is why were the students really taking my course, it was because I wanted them to learn how to design experiments. I wanted them to learn how to do observations, how to do the data analysis, all of these experimental or scientific skills that they should develop. More than that, I wanted them to develop the hands-on skills, when you're performing the experiments, how are you really conducting yourself? And that becomes a very important thing in practical exams. And of course, with that, the conceptual understanding of the experiment and its implications on the theory. What does it really mean? So when we wanted to design an exam that was fair to all of these intended learning outcomes, and going back to what Asim said, is when we have our ILOs clear, we really can design good assessments. So let me just take experimental design, for example. What we did was, each of the questions that the students had to solve was a puzzle. It wasn't something that they had already done, but it required them to use one of the experimental skills that they had learned. And pretty much like we kept all the glassware together. The students had to go and choose the glassware they want to use to conduct a particular experiment. So very, very small things we paid attention to, that are we really assessing. So if the student chose the wrong glassware, it tells us that he or she probably cannot think of the scale of the experiment. So let's say you're doing a 10-gram reaction, but you use a really, really huge reactor, it's probably not the best way out. For hands-on skills, we designed an observation rubrics for the people who were really in that room at that time. So for example, here you can see, for the student was doing a TLC experiment, whether pencil was used, whether the solvent level was appropriately placed, whether the solvent strip was used, even the cleanup, whether the glassware was clean at the end, whether they left the workplace clean. So for hands-on skills, we relied on an observation rubric that the teacher observed each student as they were conducting the experiment. And they were also asked a few questions which talked about their own experiment and how did they analyze the data of their experiments. That is what we called as the worksheet. Of course, there were some theory questions that talked about linking all of this to the conceptual understanding. So when we combined all of these things, trust me, and this was one of the best feedback that I got in that year, was that this was one of the most fair assessment according to the students about the things that they learned in this class. Very often it was beforehand people used to feel that the moment you get highest yield, you get more mark. Highest yield meaning the more product you make, the more marks you get. Nobody paid attention to the purity of the product in the experiment. So the way to design good performance based assessments is, again, think of what the students are doing, what do I want them to learn, and then come up with the observation sheet. One thing, you might think that this would have taken a lot of time, a lot more efforts by everyone, but when we appealed to all other teachers, when we said that we are conducting such an experiment regarding assessments, would you like to be an observer? And we got so many hands on board. Everyone came together to really assess one practical exam, and it was such a wonderful feeling at the end when the students said that this was one of the fair and the most interesting exams that they took. Going forward, I want to share a value rubric packet, and this goes back to the performance-based assessment. This is a value rubric packet you will also get. This is from Berkeley, and they have really created these rubrics for each kind of task. So inquiry-based learning, creative thinking, collaborative work. For all of these, how do I really make a fair rubric? So in this you can see that capstone is something that they say that highest marks, milestones is somewhere in between, and benchmark is probably something that you expect the students to do at minimum. For inquiry-based learning, they have taken topic selection, existing knowledge research, design process, analysis, conclusions. And for each of these quality or criteria, as Apurva was talking, they have created the rubric. So when we send the drive link to you, please have a look at this. And going back to the very first assessment that I had shared, wherein a lot of people submitted different kinds of works. There were videos, there were some cartoons, there were some nice cupcakes that we enjoyed in class. How do I really grade it? Like when I had to assign a grade, I told them that I'm not an expert in all of these fields, so I really cannot assess how beautiful your painting was, or how your cookies were with respect to the taste of them, but I can assess the chemistry of it. So when we were looking at the assessment of extra credit, I did assess them based on whether the chemistry was right, and considerably how much effort did I think that they put in making that particular thing. And just to give them an incentive, I also used to make something in that semester with my students, and I told them that I will also make something with you. So this is, I just thought of sharing because it's right here. This was an amino acid bowl, and I made a series of bowls that semester for my students, just so that they also get an incentive to work with me. So together we can make learning fun. Assessments are a way to make learning fun. So back to you, Apurva. I just wanted to ask you, is that all? I mean, we make good rubrics and we give good grades. Is that all?
As Prachi and then so as Prachi and then Asim and then now you have been saying, formative feedback. So formative assessments are basically something it should be used as a tool for learning, right? And that learning will not happen effectively unless you give students formative feedback as well. So you do conduct formative assessments ongoing during the class, intermittently and so on. But if students don't hear back from you about their performance, then it doesn't really serve the entire purpose that it was meant for, right? So it is very, very important to also supplement formative assessments with feedback to students. And this feedback should not be critical or just pointing out errors and mistakes. It should be more dialogue based, where students are comfortable to discuss their learning with the teacher and so on. And it is very important because it will close the gap between the actual learning and the intended learning, like Asim said, the intended learning outcomes that you have in mind, and how far are your students from those is something that you will know from the formative assessment, and your students will know when you give them feedback on the formative assessment. So actual performance right now plus some formative feedback that you give your students will lead them towards the desired performance. So feedback is really a very important part of the whole assessment cycle, and formative assessment particularly. And so what are some good features of formative feedback? One, that it should be timely, right? That is, it's a very obvious kind of thing to say, but if the students get to know that they didn't do well in the mid-sem test only at the end of the semester, that's not really going to help them learn better for the rest of the semester. So it has to be timely, it has to be specific. And this cartoon exactly talks about that. It just saying good dog or bad dog is not going to tell the student, the dog, what mistake it made. So similarly, this just excellent or this very poor quality assignment is not going to tell the students where they went wrong. So in this particular factor, even rubrics can help you give good constructive specific feedback, right? When they have a rubric of assessment, they will know that, oh, my writing skills were not good, or my conceptual understanding is where the problem is. Maybe I should work more on that, right? So it has to be specific, it has to be goal directed, always moving towards your intended outcomes, right? And learning goals, like Asim also referred to. It should be descriptive enough for them to be able to use it for improving their own learning, and should be ongoing and encouraging self-assessment. So so basically feedback and talking about how they did on an assignment or a test encourages them to be reflective about their own learning, which is always a great skill actually, apart from all of the particular topics that they are learning in the course. Self-assessment and being reflective about your own learning is a very important skill, which the process of giving formative feedback will automatically inculcate. So there are the benefits of doing formative assessments and giving formative feedback for teachers, which we have already sort of talked about. This is just a summary for lack of time. I'm not going to go into each of these points, but it gives you a judgment on the current engaging part of engagement is what it tells you about, making learning barriers visible, pointing out misconceptions and so on. And for students, of course, it helps them monitor their own learning, do something about it, identify their areas of weakness and work on them, and also reducing uncertainty about the performance. So this was a question that we got asked in the chat also. I think Prachi sir had asked how to reduce the anxiety about high stakes performance. Continuous engagement, continuous assessment, formative assessment and feedback is one of the ways which will bring confidence into students about their own learning, and hence it will reduce their anxiety and uncertainty about their about performance in a final high stake summative kind of evaluation or exam. Right. So we hope that overall we've been able to give you the purpose of assessment, the different types of assessments, how assessments can be in different modes and not just just question answer or multiple MCQ, but also performance based assessment, and how this process of conducting formative assessment helps the teacher, and getting feedback on these assessments helps the students as well. So formative assessment and formative feedback is a loop. It's an ongoing process which will take us closer every time to our intended learning goals and intended learning outcomes. So just again to summarize, core elements of formative assessment: identification of the gaps, feedback, getting students involved in their own learning, and the process continues. So I know we've gone fairly over time, but I hope we have been able to give you a gist of a topic which is actually too vast to cover even in a whole series of webinars by itself, which is assessment. And thank you so much. I request Shanti now to talk about something that we had promised you that we will do, which is to introduce some online tools. Over to you, Shanti.
Thank you, Apurva, and thank you, Neeraja, for making it so clear and also making us understand what actually, how to do the assessment and how, what are the benefits of using rubrics. And we have here simple online tools which we have also tried implementing in this entire webinar series. So, like I'll just scan through them quickly because of lack of time, but you can we are going to share these presentation with you so you can see it. And the white highlighted one is what we really want you to try, because this is like a huge sea of tools of online tools especially, which are available, and how and which will be good and how we can use it will be very difficult to select. So we can so this is a small suggestion, so you can have quizzes and polls. We have used some polls in Zoom also. You can try that. Questionnaires in the form of Google form. We can have word clouds or tag clouds like Mentimeters or word art. We can have yeah, brainstorming, especially you can use Padlet. We have also used Padlet, so that can also be used as one of the very effective online tool for assessment. You can also use concept map, and Jamboard is a very interesting concept map making online platform, which will be very useful for assessing the students whether they have attained the concept. Then rubrics, already Apurva told this. And if you go for all rubrics, this online tool actually will help you to get a template also to develop your rubrics. We can go next as a feedback. There is formative, which you can use as a good feedback collecting tool on which you can use it online. We also have various games actually. Neeraja also discussed these games, and of course the video, the next one is a video and audio. So in this Kahoot and any Moto can also be used. So these online tools are very useful, but it depends upon very important two questions. And the question is, why I'm assessing and what I am assessing. So if I'm clear with that, I can select the tools and I can use them whenever I need it, and it will be really helpful for my students also. Some of you have asked question that we have very less time, and in that if we are using this, how it is possible. So it all depends upon your planning. So in the alignment table which Asim shared, how you plan your entire work, and based on that how you plan your learning experiences, based on that how you plan your assessment will also be very effective. And we can have the last slide of this entire session. So assessment is probably the most ignored part of good teaching. So it is often the most intimidating to the instructors. And I think all of you will agree with this. So what we have to say is, can we go for the next? Once instructors or we teachers become familiar with this iterative process of assessing, teaching, and then again reassessing, and of teaching students to evaluate themselves, teaching would without ample assessment feels like grouping in the dark. And it's hard to imagine teaching without it. So we really don't want you to live in dark, and we really want you to think about assessment when you are planning your teaching. So assessment is not the end, though we are taking it in the end of this entire webinar series, but it is not the end. In fact, it is, if we have said that it is the same coin and two sides are of it. So when we are planning our learning experiences, at the same time if we plan our assessments also, it will be much easier and also helpful for us also as a teacher. So thank you so much for giving us this wonderful experience, and I hope you will also use this happy to interact with you. There are we can take only 4 questions right now because of lack of time, and I will directly jump into the first question to Prachi. I would ask, can we say that summative assessment is more like an evaluation? What do you think, Prachi, about this?
So, yes, summative assessment and evaluation, if you see, there are many overlapping points into it. Yes. So, but as we discussed earlier also, that summative assessment is conducted at the end of a semester or term, etc., to evaluate or to know students understanding about the concept. But you look at evaluation. So evaluation is also, some sort of assessment that you're doing, but over here evaluation is of a particular course. If I say that, there are 6 to 7 subjects which are there for a student, so if I say evaluation of all that entire course that the student is taking part, or how much fair the students have done good in that particular course at the end of the entire course, so evaluation is of the course, right? So it
Okay.
is,
Yes.
that is the major difference, that
Okay.
summative, but as as it said also, that there are many overlapping factors in summative assessment especially, and evaluation.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Prachi, for this. Now, Asim, there is a question. Does it mean that one goal is broken down into more than one objective when we are designing IOLOs?
Yes, I also saw that question, I think from Sangeeta ma'am.
Yes.
So yes, absolutely. Goal being a larger picture, a larger expectation, right? And in the objective, you are supposed to break it down. And obviously, there will be more than one objectives for a particular lesson or a particular topic. So that's absolutely right. So goal can, I mean, can be broken into more than one objectives, and it should be like that. More you break it down, more it will be clear for us in using and basically aligning those objectives into the assessment types.
Okay, thank you. Now, the next question I will ask to Neeraja. Hasabne sir has asked this question that how can assessment and evaluation be transformed into what our Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi once said, the celebration of learning. You're mute, actually. Yeah.
Thank you. So, thank you, Satashra sir. I think I already gave one example wherein all my students and me myself, I used to be eagerly looking at what is the end of term semester, submission from my students regarding what are they doing this in this extra credit assessment or assignment. But more importantly, whenever we are assessing, again, if we go back to ILOs, like what do I want my students to learn? If it is an application based assessment that I'm doing, very often the students will enjoy, because in doing that assessment itself, they will learn something. So when we are designing, especially practical exams, as I was saying, that doing something that they have already done, repeating the same experiment, probably not the best way to design a practical exam. But repeat or making them do that experiment to solve a puzzle, and suddenly that assessment becomes a process in which they also start learning together. So here in project based assessments or problem based assessments really will make it as a celebration of learning.
Yeah. Thank
So
you.
do try it out. It's really fun. Yes.
Thank you, Neeraja. Yeah. Now, this is a last question I will ask to Dr. Apurva Barve. So, Apurva, uh, how should teacher analyze a formative assessment and summative assessment for her own development? Like how should we the performance graph to be interpreted? And this has been asked by the name is not there. Yeah.
Okay, excellent question. Actually, we've been talking a lot about how performance-based or various kinds of formative and summative assessments should help students in learning. But it is equally important, and we didn't get too much time to spend on those slides, but we'll share them with you. Formative assessments are an excellent way for teacher also to self-reflect. We've just discussed a little bit about how the practice of self-reflection and self-evaluation is very important to inculcate in students, and it is equally important for the teacher as well. For example, if you conduct regular formative assessments and try to gauge what students have learned for using tools like what Neeraja referred to, muddiest point, clearest point. If you know really a big substantial number or proportion of your class has said that this particular point was the muddiest point for us, that sort of reflects and helps the teacher to design that particular learning of that particular assessment in a better way. So the formative assessment process is extremely important in giving the teacher a sort of snapshot about his or her own teaching, right?
Yes.
This is something that they should also get used to incorporating. This is the cycle of performing, evaluating our own performance. In this case, it is a performance of teaching, right? We have been talking about students' performance, but it's also the performance of teaching. Whether it is aligning to learning goals or not, your rubrics and your formative assessments can give you a reading on whether how aligned your teaching and learning in the classroom is towards your intended outcomes. So definitely it is a very important tool for teachers. And you've introduced all of us, Shanti, but what about you?
Okay,
I know that all of the audience has already met Shanti in the second webinar of this series. And let me tell you, she's an amazing colleague to work with. The kind of energy and the kind of enthusiasm that Shanti brings. And I'm not even going to talk about her academic training, extremely high level academic training of masters in mathematics and an MEd and being a teacher educator for so many years. But the sheer energy and enthusiasm that she brings makes her a brilliant teacher, and it is not possible that you sit in Shanti's class and you are not excited or motivated. So that's the kind of teacher that Shanti is. Thank you so much, Shanti, for coordinating this session.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, most of the questions have been answered in the entire discussion only. And I feel this assessment, Neeraja, is actually there should be assessment part 2 also, because it feels that this entire assessment webinar is like we just gave a preview of the things. Entire assessment webinar should also begin. And though this is one of the last series, because the next one will be the last series. You want to say something before that?
Yes, so I just wanted to say that there are some brilliant questions before we end, and we will submit the answers to these questions again in an email. We will share the draft. As we said, we will try our best to get all the answers to you. So you will be getting that in the email. That's all I wanted to add.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much. And I think so most of the teachers, they have got their answers they were hidden in the entire session also. The answers were actually there in the session. So thank you so much, the entire team, for coming together and giving this experience of learning and assessing together. And the next session it is said that often we know about a very famous quote, is the best teacher is the teacher who inspires. So we actually get inspiration from our own. We say that he's none other than Padma Shri Arvind Gupta ji, and we have him to be as our last speaker for making things and learning science. So he
Grand
will,
finale.
yeah, so he's for the last webinar, and we are very excited for his session, and I hope so you will also be very excited, and it's an amazing experience to interact with him. I'm very happy that he's going to be there, and you can get most of it, and all the best for your future and for this webinar series.
Yes.
Over to you, Neeraja. You want to say
Questions
anything?
ready. No, all I wanted to say that please keep your questions ready for Arvind Gupta sir. And, like this is the second last webinar. We will get back to you with the instructions about the whole end of the series things, which also has an assessment in place. So we are trying our best to make it fun. We will come back to you in an email about how we are going to assess the whole learning that has happened in this webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
everyone. Bye.
Thank you.